action on the 18th of April, 1942. So imagine, if you will, Mr. J.R. Smith and Mr. John Ferguson as Doolittle Raiders in absentia as they prepare to launch from our runway today in wild cargo. Again, with those right engines turning, burning, preparing to hurl our B-25 skyward in just a few moments. Although militarily speaking, the Doolittle raid achieved. Now moving forward under power from our runway. Flight today by one of the great planes, again with Mr. John Ferguson and Mr. J.R. Smith at the controls of Wild Cargo. Just had their short Sterling. The 17 shortcomings would be revealed later on, and the 24 Liberator would join her in service with the U.S. Army Air Forces, but the Royal Air Force would pioneer the truly heavy bomber in the form of the Handley Page Halifax and the Avro Lancaster, which itself was derived from an earlier medium bomber, the Avro Manchester. So think, if you will, back to 1941, 1942, you would be more likely to see a twin-engine bomber, such as a Lockheed Vega, or a Lockheed Hudson, or a Martin Maryland, or a Douglas Boston. During the Doolittle raid in 1942, had major modifications performed to them, including the removal of their lower gun turret, the installation of de-icers and anti-icing equipment. Steel blast plates were also mounted on the fuselage around the lower turret. Heavy radio equipment was removed. Additional fuel tanks were put in place from on board the deck of the USS Hornet. Flights of this kind were highly unconventional for the time and would remain so for the duration of the war, although land-based aircraft would occasionally be operated from aircraft carriers, mostly in ferry flights and one-way flights. And we should consider that the flights undertaken as part of the Doolittle raid were considered to be one way. They were not going to be recovered by the Hornet, they were not going to land on another aircraft carrier, and they did not have sufficient range to reach a friendly airfield. Making short work of the slipstream, crosswinds that she evaded on takeoff from our runway. And when I say that the B-25 that made a forced landing in Siberia, Russia, was never seen again, that's not for want of trying. For years, in fact, people have speculated as to what the outcome was with regards to that. It's filled with an array of machine guns and cannon that could be used for ground strafing runs and ground attack missions, not unlike the museum's own de Havilland Mosquito, the Mark 26 version, which is a fighter bomber. So the B-25, serving ably as both a bomber and a fighter bomber, would have packed quite a punch. Having discharged her bomb load, could then address targets of opportunity, filling them full of lead, as it were, with all of the guns bearing down on her target. During the exhaustion of the B-25, the front cyclone is just thundering away. Nothing else quite like it. than 4,000 B-25Js were built, although far fewer of them surviving today, as mentioned previously. It served very capably its role. However, the life expectancy of airframes was relatively short, not only through attrition, but also through stress and in fact, there was a secret and silent war waged in the background behind the air war. If we consider that the aircraft themselves were the tip of the spear being wielded by the 8th Air Force and its subsidiaries, or the Royal Air Force and its subsidiaries, we can consider the guarantees provided by the brave men and women at ground stations that track their missions and ensure that they stay on course and on target. As a matter of fact, most bomber missions conducted, especially by the strategic bomber forces during World War II, and particularly by the 8th Air Force, they were lucky if 1 in 10 aircraft actually reached, let alone hit, their target. Navigation was quite poor, and as a matter of fact, even on the ground you might be lucky if you came within 5 miles of your actual position, taking a sun sight and using a sextant. Aerial observation was certainly used while flying the B-25. In fact, if you look at most medium and heavy bombers from the period, you will see what looks like a tiny little turret on the top of the roof. Well, that is not actually for a gunner. That is for an observer who would be responsible for taking a sun or a star sighting using a sextant to plot their course based on the navigational aid. But the poor accuracy of this meant that before the advent of radio navigation beams, and remember, this is in a world before we had anything like Garmin providing us with tracking from satellites. Everything had either to be done by visual observation or by the use of radio navigation beams. And so the invisible war that was waged was largely between the American and British forces in Europe and Germany and its forces to either interfere with, jam, their ability to design aircraft and to detect enemy aircraft. As a matter of fact, the British developed not only German night fighters could attack bombers such as B-25s was so extreme that the Monica system was dispensed with by the British, and instead they relied on more simple countermeasures, but things such as window, or as the Germans called it, Jupel, which were essentially strips of aluminum foil that would be dropped in the air to mask the formations of bombers, or even to mimic formations of bombers to make the Germans think that we might be attacking one target, whereas in fact we were prosecuting the war against an entirely different one. The idea being to draw the German night fighter forces away to another sector in order to protect the bomber forces as they approached their targets. B-25s flying by day, flying by night, on sea and over land, certainly were some of the most iconic and impressive medium bombers of the Second World War, but we should not overlook the fact that they were not alone, and they were not the only designs, nor were they necessarily the most successful. As a matter of fact, B-26 Marauders are considered to have been, despite very difficult early days in terms of training and delivery, once the bugs were worked out, the B-26 Marauder went on to have an excellent safety record and had similar performance to the B-25, at least in terms of its service as a medium bomber with the United States Army Air Forces. This should not be confused with the later B-26, which was in fact a development of a Douglas design, initially the A-20 Havoc, which was developed further, and the later B-26 continued in service with the United States Air Force until the Vietnam War. So touching down now, Mr. J.R. Smith and John Ferguson, Wild Cargo returning safely to the MAM. A round of applause, please, for our vigilant, fearless raiders today. So it is my belief, although we might be lucky, I don't